$2,500 is the most for both of them to be dead.
For both, okay. That's both.
$5,000 for the girl. $2,500 for the mother.
Okay, we're spending.
A suburban Texas morning. A car sits, idling in a parking lot. Inside, a mother sits across from a man that she believes can help her solve a problem. She's calm, polite. Her tone is almost conversational. She even laughs. But what she's discussing is not divorce, or debt, or revenge in the usual sense. It's a murder for hire. And the targets? A classmate of her 13-year-old daughter, and that classmate's mother. Somewhere in the background of this dark transaction is a middle school cheerleading tryout. That is the scale of this conflict. I'm Brittany Ransom, and this is When Killers Get Caught, a podcast where I examine the people, the psychology, and the moments that lead to the most extreme acts of violence, and what happens when the darkness finally meets the light. Today's case is the story of Wanda Holloway. And the question at the center of it is almost impossible to answer without sounding like a dark joke. How does a church-going, middle-class Texas mom end up trying to have a child and her mother killed over a cheerleading competition? Not a threat to her safety, not a scandal that might ruin her life, a school activity, a list of names taped to the gym wall. And yet, by the time Wanda opened her mouth in that car, agreeing to the price of 2 lives, she truly believed it was really worth it. Let's set the stage. This is Channelview, Texas, late 1980s, in the early 1990s. On the surface, it looks like a familiar slice of American suburbia. Quiet streets, church parking lots, full-on Sundays, school sports at the center of community life. These were families who knew each other through PTA meetings, Friday night football games, and neighborhood routines that repeated week after week. But beneath that surface, something more intense was brewing. In communities like this, achievement doesn't just belong to the children. It becomes a shared family project. Kids aren't just students or athletes. They're reflections of their parents' effort, sacrifice, and identity. A good report card is a source of pride. Making the team is a social signal. And for many, school competitions become an unspoken hierarchy that determines exactly where you stand in town. Cheerleading, in particular, sits right at the top of that hierarchy, in its visibility, popularity, and status condensed into one single tryout. So when parents talk about supporting their kids in this community, it was often something far more complicated than just simple encouragement. It became pressure, investment, competition by proxy. And in an environment like that, small setbacks don't stay small for long. They grow, quietly at first, into something far more consuming. Now, to outsiders, cheerleading looks like a straightforward extracurricular activity. Pom-poms, routines, school spirit, a performance. And it's kind of the performance before the real game begins. But in Texas during the late 1980s and early 90s, that surface-level view misses almost everything that actually mattered. In these towns, cheerleading didn't operate like an after-school activity. It was like a tightly controlled social institution. It had its own structure, its own hierarchy, consequences that extended far past the gym. Making the squad wasn't just about your athletic ability or your enthusiasm and charisma. It was a brutal sorting process that reflected and reinforced the social order of the community itself. Tryouts weren't casual. They were highly formalized, high-stakes events. There were outside judges, rigid scoring systems, custom choreography. And the elimination rounds would determine a teenager's social standing for the rest of the year. A single misstep, one bad impression, a fraction of a point could be the difference between inclusion and absolute invisibility. And surrounding those tryouts was the entire aggressive ecosystem of adult involvement. The parents didn't just watch from the bleachers. They had engineered this path for their children, paid for private coaches, special choreography, intense tumbling classes, special uniforms, elite summer training camps designed specifically to give their children an edge. They lobbied, they built relationships, and they navigated the unspoken, sometimes toxic politics of selection. Because everyone in town understood exactly what was at stake here. Cheerleading wasn't about school spirit. It was about visibility, popularity made official, a public, undeniable endorsement of who mattered and who definitely didn't. And for the parents, it was deeply personal. It was a daughter's placement on a squad felt like a direct reflection of the family itself, their status, their effort, and their right to belong to that community. In an environment like that, cheerleading stopped really being a sport. It became social currency. And like any currency tied to identity and survival, it had the power to turn ordinary disappointment into something very dangerous. Before the story turns, let's look at the people inside of it. On paper, this is a story about two families living in the same suburban neighborhood. In reality, though, it is a slow motion collision of identity, ambition, and proximity, where ordinary relationships slowly blend and then break under the pressure of competition. Wanda Holloway was a deeply religious, middle-class mother raising her family in Channelview. To the outside world, she was the blueprint of a responsible, involved suburban mom. She participated in her community, went to church, and invested heavily in her children's future. But beneath the typical exterior, Wanda was attaching a dangerous amount of emotional weight to her daughter's success. Cheerleading was no longer just an after-school activity. It had become an intimate validation of Wanda's own worth. What started as a normal parental encouragement slowly curdled into a strange fixation. To Wanda, a rejection from the squad wasn't just bad luck. It was public judgment on her capability as a mother. She wasn't just a parent anymore. She was becoming a force willing to reshape reality to match her expectations. And then there was Verna Heath. She lived nearby. At one point, she and Wanda weren't adversaries at all. They were neighbors, churchgoers, acquaintances, part of the same tight-knit social fabric. Verna's daughter was also a cheerleader, but unlike Wanda's daughter, she was thriving in it. The differences were small at first, the kind of details most people wouldn't even register. But in a town where a child's achievement is publicly ranked, small differences are toxic. As the competition intensified, the warmth between Wanda and Verna evaporated. Casual conversations became very strained. Proximity itself was a pressure cooker. There were no longer just two moms chatting in a driveway. They had become opposing forces in a system that neither of them created, but they were both now trapped inside of it. And then there was Shanna Holloway, Wanda's 13-year-old daughter, the absolute center of this entire storm and the least responsible for any of it. Shanna was just a middle school kid navigating the messy world of adolescence. Friendships, braces, school routines. She wanted to make the cheerleading squad, sure, but not because of adult status or social currency. She wanted it because her environment told her that this is the activity that mattered. Shanna wasn't a strategist. She wasn't an active participant in the psychological warfare around her. She was just a little kid placed inside a pressure cooker that was rapidly growing bigger than her whole life. And then there was Amber Heath, Verna's daughter. Naturally talented, very skilled, and already held a coveted spot on the cheer squad. She represented the exact peak of the mountain that the other aspiring middle schoolers were all trying to get to. But in this narrative, Amber's tragedy is that her individuality was erased. To Wanda Holloway, Amber was not just a neighborhood kid. She was a benchmark, a living roadblock to her own daughter's happiness. Amber didn't drive the tension between the adults. She didn't escalate it either. She was just living her life and doing something she was naturally good at. But in competitive ecosystems like this one in Channelview, human beings stop being people. They become obstacles. And in the distance between seeing a neighborhood child as just a successful student and seeing her as the reason my life is ruined, those two were about to cross in ways that no one anticipated. Up to this point, Wanda Holloway looks like another hyper-focused parent. She's caught up in this whole competitive thing going on in her Texas suburb. Someone reacting poorly to disappointment. Someone caught up in a local rivalry that maybe has started to spiral out of control. But to understand the dark turn that this story is about to take, we have to look backward. Because for Wanda, this obsession didn't begin with her daughter. It started with her own reflection in the mirror. See, decades earlier, Wanda had wanted to be the kind of teenager that Amber Heath was. She understood the unspoken rules of the town long before she had her own children. She knew that those girls in the pleated skirts held the keys to the kingdom. They had all the visibility, the belonging, and the absolute social adoration that Wanda desperately craved. But Wanda could never make the squad. She was rejected over and over again. The door to that elite world was shut in her face, and the emotional wound from that teenage rejection had never properly healed. It didn't fade with time. It hardened into resentment. That unfinished, empty feeling stayed with her well into adulthood, waiting until Wanda became the mother of a young girl. And then cheerleading re-entered her life. But this time, it wasn't an activity. It was an intervention. Shanna was the vessel for Wanda's second chance. What looked like neighbors just passionately supporting their children was actually much more complex. This was an attempt at a historical rewrite for Wanda. She wasn't just paying for tumbling classes or cheering from the sidelines. She was trying to reach back into her own past and fix something broken from her own childhood. She wasn't just watching her 13-year-old try out for middle school cheer squad. Wanda was trying to save the teenage version of herself. And when that second chance was threatened, she didn't just see a teenage setback. Wanda saw all of her old wounds ripped wide open all over again, and she couldn't let it happen another time. In the spring of 1989, Shanna Holloway walked into the gym at Alice Johnson Junior High to try out for the cheerleading squad. By any objective standard, it was a completely ordinary teenage milestone. Just a room full of kids, all performing the same routines, forcing smiles, waiting for that list to get taped up on the wall. The kind of high school drama that feels like the entire world in the moment. But inevitably, it fades into the background of life. Shanna came close, painfully close. When the scores were tallied, she had narrowly missed making the squad by a microscopic margin. In almost any other household, a result like this would trigger a pretty normal routine. A difficult evening, maybe some tears, a little bit of parental reassurance. It's okay, you'll make it next year. And eventually, a return to normal life. It becomes a heavy but necessary life lesson in resilience. We all can't win at everything, right? A reminder that disappointment is just a part of growing up. But in the Holloway home, that loss was not allowed to settle. Instead of allowing the moment to pass, it became a ghost that haunted their home. Picked at, re-examined, dissected. To Wanda, the result didn't mean the other girl had a better day. It meant that the system was rigged and that something had been stolen from her. What should have just been a closed door became an open wound. And once a loss stops feeling final, it stops feeling small. For Wanda Holloway, this wasn't the end of a middle school tryout season. It was the moment she stopped looking at her daughter's reality and started looking for someone to blame. What happened next isn't a sudden break. There's no single dramatic moment where Wanda decided to cross the unthinkable line. Instead, the descent is incremental. It's a slow, steady turn of the dial. So gradual that the water reaches a boil before anyone realizes they're cooking. It begins with interpretation. At first, Wanda simply reframed the loss. Shanna didn't just miss the squad because of a bad day. She had been actively kept out. That explanation shifts outward, away from the daughter, and toward the world. The system is now the suspect. The judge is biased. The entire process was rigged, and that narrative took root. It naturally demands a villain. That's when the Heaths stop being their neighbors, and they become the co-conspirators. Then came the fixation. What should have been a temporary emotional bruise hardened into an obsession. This tryout was no longer an isolated event in the spring of 1989. It was the lens through which Wanda viewed her own past failures. The disappointment wasn't processed and released like normal. She began to feed it, relive it, analyze it, weaponize it into a grand story about a great injustice. And finally, escalation through investment. Wanda started pouring massive amounts of money into correcting the past. More private coaching, elite cheer camps, intensive training, every financial sacrifice framed as a way to level the playing field that she believes is crooked. To the neighbors, it looks like fierce dedication. But psychologically, it functions like a trap. Every dollar spent deepens her commitment. Every check written raises the stakes. When you invest that much of your own wealth, time, and identity into a single outcome, failure ceases to be an option. The outcome must be corrected at any cost. Nothing is broken yet, though. No laws have been violated. But the logic inside of Wanda's mind had fundamentally shifted. Fixing the problem was no longer about Shanna working harder or learning a better routine. For Wanda, it shifted towards the matter of removal. By this point, the narrative had shifted. It's no longer a story about a cheerleading or a suburban competition or even a local feud. This had become a story about the dangerous blurring of identity. It's about what happens when a parent stops raising a child and starts living through them. What had started as simply passionate support had now curdled into total enmeshment. With every private coach she hired, every camp she paid for, every late night strategy session, the emotional boundary between Shanna and Wanda began to evaporate. The line disappeared. Success was no longer something that Shanna achieved. It was something that Wanda experienced. And failure was no longer a setback that Shanna endured. It became a devastating emotional blow that Wanda absorbed. Every single outcome took on a suffocating, outsized meaning. A good performance isn't just a happy middle school milestone. It was absolute validation, proof that Wanda's sacrifice was justified, proof that she could bend the world to her will. But a setback, even a minor one, that carried terrifying weight. To Wanda, her daughter struggling doesn't look like a 13-year-old having an off day. It's a direct personal assault on Wanda, a public rejection of her own worth. And this created a volatile feedback loop. The deeper Wanda sank into her daughter's life, the more fragile her own sanity became. The stakes weren't rising because the middle school rules had changed. They were rising because the internal meaning of every jump, kick, or smile was now a matter of psychological survival for Wanda. Shanna was still the same child, still trying to navigate the normal, messy processes of growing up. But to her mother, Shanna was no longer a person anymore. She was a vessel, a container for Wanda's unfulfilled dreams, her deepest insecurities, and her entire identity. And once those boundaries were fully gone, Shanna's life stopped belonging to her. As the next tryout season loomed on the horizon, spring of 1990, the emotional logic Wanda had built over months of just dark contemplations narrowed to a single point of focus. She only had one obstacle: Amber Heath. And at this stage, Amber is not being processed as a neighborhood kid, a classmate, or even a competing student. In Wanda's very disoriented internal framing, Amber was something like a concrete wall, an unavoidable, permanent barrier that repeatedly blocked the glory that should have belonged to the Holloways. This is where the perception shifted dangerously. That competitive environment, which once involved dozens of students, multiple judges, complex point systems, suddenly compressed into a stark, very simplified binary. Shanna versus Amber. Success versus obstruction. Good versus evil. And because the stakes are now so intimately personal, Amber isn't just a talented cheerleader who is better positioned to make the squad. She had become symbolic of everything Wanda believed was standing in the way of her own psychological healing. Think about the horror of that shift. A literal child being reframed as existential dread, not because of anything Amber had done, but because of what her mere existence now represented inside Wanda's addled brain. At that point, competition is no longer competition. Wanda's viewing this as a blockage, and any barrier that stands between you and survival, you're not trying to compete. You're trying to destroy it. Somewhere in the darkest stretch of Wanda's fixation, the very architecture of her problem had changed. The framework shifted. We'd moved from competition to elimination, and the plan for something like that requires a bridge between fantasy and reality, requires a door into a world that Wanda just didn't belong to. To open that door, she approached her former brother-in-law, Terry Harper. Wanda looked at Terry and saw a man with rough around the edges reputation, and in her mind, he was her connection to the underworld. A guy who could find her a hitman to quietly make her problems go away. She believed by approaching Terry that she was finally taking control of her family's destiny. In reality, she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Because Terry Harper wanted absolutely no part of a murder plot. The moment that Wanda started talking about eliminating people, Terry realized just how dangerous his brother's ex-wife had become. He didn't cover for her. Instead, he went straight to the police, agreed that he would wear a wire, and became the state's star informant. Wanda had no idea she was walking into a trap. So when Terry came back to her with pricing from the fictitious hitman, Wanda treated it like a normal business negotiation. And you heard that at the beginning of this episode. That moment where Wanda began discussing the actual numbers, how much she thought Amber and Verna were worth. She didn't just target Verna Heath. She asked, what's it cost to kill both of them? And the answer she got back was a grim lesson in the economics of murder for hire. The price tag was $7,500. But for Verna, it'll just be $2,500. As investigators would later document, in the dark trade of murdering people for hire, children are most expensive. Faced with those numbers, Wanda made a calculation. This wasn't a sudden awakening of her conscience that saved 13-year-old Amber's life. It was Wanda's budget. She didn't have $7,500 liquid. She said it was too high. She chose the more practical, cheaper option. She would pay $2,500 to have the mother killed and let the emotional dominoes do the rest of the work for her. In her warped internal logic, this was an elegant strategy of indirect resolution. If Verna Heath was dead, Amber would be destroyed. She would be entirely too emotionally overwhelmed to perform, too grief-stricken to show up for the audition. The competitive field would clear itself out, and Shanna would get that spot by default. It was a math problem she was solving through trauma, a murder leading to a childhood devastated, leaving to an empty spot on a junior high cheer squad. In Wanda's mind, this wasn't a monstrous escalation anymore. This was just cost effective. Taking a step back, let's go back to Terry. Once Terry Harper realized that his former sister-in-law was asking him to find someone to murder a neighborhood child, the case shifted from what we would say would be rumor to evidence. He was actually horrified by how casually Wanda had asked him to broker a double homicide. So Terry didn't hesitate. He contacted law enforcement, and suddenly the murder plot was no longer a hypothetical grievance whispered in a kitchen. It was an active criminal investigation. But the police faced a unique challenge now. They had to prove that this ordinary church-going suburban mom was actually serious. To find that out, that's why they needed to fit Terry with the recording equipment and orchestrate a controlled meeting. The goal was simple. Get Wanda in a confined space, not a lot of noise. Step back and let her talk. They sent Terry in a car to meet her, knowing that whatever happened next would be preserved in real time. And what unfolded over the next several hours would become some of the most infamous audio evidence in American true crime history. This was no longer a rumor about what Wanda might have said. This was her own voice, recorded and replayed, speaking plainly about killing people. And when you listen to it, the most striking detail isn't anger. There's no shouting, no emotional breakdown. She doesn't sound sad or angry. She's completely composed, almost conversational. Her tone is steady, measured, and entirely practical. She discusses the logistics of ending a woman's life like you might negotiate your car repair. When Terry brings up the $2,500 hitman fee, there's an almost transactional quality to the response. She isn't negotiating abstract violence. She's managing a project. She talks about the steps, the timing, and the delivery. And threaded throughout the entire recording is a single recurring anxiety. Tell him he has a deadline. It must happen before the upcoming cheerleading tryouts. That date is given the utmost urgency, more than any sort of moral or legal boundary. The most unsettling part of these tapes is not the monstrous act being proposed, but her ordinary delivery. You heard it. She didn't sound like a cinematic villain. No dramatic escalation in tone, just a calm, polite voice outlining an unthinkable tragedy as if it belongs in the same category as an everyday problem-solving discussion. It's that exact contrast that makes the recordings disturbing. From the moment they got that recording, the situation could no longer be contained. And on January 30th, 1991, Channelview was suddenly confronted with a version of reality no one had any idea how to process. The image of Wanda Holloway, the church-going, dependable suburban mom, coming out of her home in handcuffs. This image violently colliding with who they thought Wanda was and who Wanda actually became. Wanda Holloway had been arrested, and this private obsession had now become a public case file. The moment she was arrested, though, the story stopped belonging to Channelview. It spread like wildfire, first dominating national headlines, then bleeding into international coverage, mutating almost immediately from local criminal case into a global cultural spectacle. Part of what drove this sensational appetite for this case was how Wanda refused to fit the contemporary concept of a criminal. She didn't look like a hardened offender. She had fluffy curls, for goodness sakes. There was no obvious edge or of malice, no stereotypical marker of a life lived on the edge. She just looked like a Sunday school teacher, the kind of woman who organized the neighborhood block party or volunteered at the school bake sale. And that contrast was part of the media's obsession, because if a woman like Wanda could plot to kill somebody over a junior high school extracurricular, then the safe boundaries of suburban living were just an illusion. And they kind of are an illusion. The case tapped into a terrifying cultural anxiety. Extreme obsession can live quietly behind manicured lawns and perfectly structured routines. The media leaned into that tension with predatory delight, and very quickly, Wanda was renamed the Texas Cheerleader Mom, the Texas Pom-Pom Mom, the Cheerleader Mom. All catchy, reductive, and very sensational. It turned what was a disturbing family tragedy into caricature. This was a character now, not a person. And when those labels took hold, the trial wasn't just about what Wanda had done. It was an arena for everything that the public feared about parental ambition that had gone too far. So there was the first trial, August of 1991. The media frenzy moved inside the heavy doors of the Harris County courtroom. The rumors were replaced by cold legal evidence. The prosecution's case, bulletproof, anchored completely with the wiretapped audio. Prosecutors laid bare the transactional coldness of the plot, showing the jury that Wanda was so determined to seal the deal, she had handed over her own diamond ring to Terry as collateral for the hitman's down payment. Faced with her own voice on tape, Wanda's defense team attempted a strategy that true crime fans still talk about today. They argued that Wanda was a lonely, bored suburban housewife engaging in a dark game of fantasy and make-believe. They said that she was just talking big to her former brother-in-law, and that she actually never intended for Berna Heath to be killed. The jury didn't buy the fantasy defense, and the calculated reality of those tapes was too much. Wanda Holloway was found guilty of solicitation of capital murder and sentenced to 15 years in prison. And for the public who was watching on the evening news, the gavel felt like closure. The obsession had met its legal end. But in reality, the case was about to take a bizarre and structural turn that would undo all of the good. Just as Wanda started serving her time, the entire conviction was erased by a stunning procedural error. During a post-trial review, the defense discovered that one of the jurors was a convicted felon who was still on probation for theft, and under Texas law, this made him legally ineligible for jury duty. To make matters worse, that specific juror hadn't just sat quietly in the booth. He was the jury foreman. The law was unyielding. It didn't matter if the juror had any influence over the verdict or if the remaining 11 would have still convicted her anyway. The structural foundation of the trial was considered compromised. The judge had no choice but to overturn the conviction and release Wanda on a $90,000 bond. For the Heath family and Texas public, this was a surreal nightmare. This case that had been filed away as closed was now right back where it was before, and not because of new evidence, because of bureaucratic oversight. By the time the state prepared to try Wanda a second time in 1996, the energy in Channelview had fundamentally shifted. The initial shock of the headlines in Texas had evaporated. The story had already been dissected by talk shows, turned into true crime lore, adapted into Hollywood scripts, and what remained in the courtroom for everyone involved was just exhaustion. For Wanda, a second trial meant another grueling public flaying. But for the prosecution, there was an even heavier hurdle: the children. Defending this case again meant forcing Amber Heath and Wanda Holloway back onto the witness stand to relive the trauma of their childhoods before a new onslaught of television cameras. 5 years had crawled by since the original arrest. The girls were both now 18 years old, on the cusp of starting their freshman year in college, trying to build new lives and step into new communities who had no idea about what happened in Channelview 5 years before. A second highly publicized trial wouldn't just force them to relive this nightmare, it would threaten to taint their future and permanently brand them as they walked onto new college campuses. Recognizing this, Verna Heath made a choice that defined the real difference between the two mothers in this story. While Wanda Holloway had been willing to exploit and orchestrate violence under the guise of supporting her daughter, Verna chose to actually protect both of them. She approached the prosecutors and she said, "I will support a plea deal." Verna sacrificed her own desire for justice and her day in court to shield these two young girls from the media wolves. In a beautiful silent act of grace, Verna proved that she cared more about the psychological survival of both daughters than Wanda ever had. Faced with no other options, Wanda entered a no contest plea. This time, the legal outlook was very different. Instead of 15 years behind bars, Wanda was given a suspended sentence and ordered to serve just 6 months in a local jail, followed by 10 years of probation. It was a resolution born out of systemic fatigue. There was no final dramatic courtroom showdown. Instead, the legal battle concluded with a quiet, negotiated whisper. Yet even as Wanda walked out of the jail after her 6-month stint, culture refused to let the story go. The Wanda Holloway case had crossed the line from true crime news into permanent American folklore. The ultimate imprint came from Hollywood. In 1993, while the legal system was still struggling with that mistrial, the entertainment industry released 2 competing television movies about the case. The definitive adaptation is HBO's The Positively True Adventures of the Alleged Texas Cheerleader Murdering Mom. It starred Holly Hunter, and it was an Emmy-winning performance. With its satirical edge and dark comedic tone, the film captured how the case was existing in public memory, a surreal intersection of suburban normal, dark comedy, and tragedy. From that point forward, Wanda Holloway's name became an active piece of cultural shorthand. She was the symbol used to explain the terrifying extremes parents will go, a warning label for what happens when the ordinary pursuit of status turns into life and death. While the courtroom battles, media coverage, and television adaptations dominate public memory of the case, the most lasting consequences never play out in front of the camera. Life continued in the quiet places where these events no longer define every single conversation. Following her release from custody and the completion of her 10-year probation, Wanda Holloway gradually stepped completely out of the public eye. She took deliberate steps to find anonymity, legally changed her name, and left Texas. There have been no further media interviews, no public statements, and no sensational returns to the spotlight. Instead, Wanda chose to quietly disappear, eventually returning to the outskirts of Houston area later in life, but under a different identity, living a life she designed as much as possible to escape the shadows of what she had done. Shanna Holloway grew into adulthood and fought to claim the narrative that belonged entirely to herself. She got married, became a mother, and built a successful life completely separate from everything that happened in 1991. Eventually, she chose to confront the past on her own terms, and she wrote a beautiful memoir called Moving Beyond the Unthinkable. And this was Shanna processing her trauma from her own perspective, in her own writings and very rare interviews. She addresses the relationship with her mother with a level of grace and maturity that completely resists simple conclusions. She acknowledges the pain, but she feels she has broken the cycle in separating her inheritance from her identity. For true crime listeners who always want to know if the victims are okay, the story of the Heath family brings a good sense of closure. The ultimate poetic irony of Wanda's plot is that it failed at every single step. Not only did Verna Heath survive, but Amber Heath went on to climb the mountain anyway, and she successfully made the high school cheer squad on her own merits. Verna Heath lived a long, full, and peaceful life as a deeply loved mother and grandmother, and she passed away quietly in 2017. But Amber, she grew up and she left the toxic hierarchy of Channelview. Today, she's happily married and works as a pediatric speech-language pathologist, dedicating her life to helping young children find their voices. And what remains for everyone involved is not a perfect cinematic ending, but the gentle passage of time. A reminder that while obsession can distort a community for a season, there's still resilience, grace, and quiet determination to move forward. At the absolute core of this case, vicarious parenting is taken to a pathological extreme. It is the gradual, quiet shift where a child's success and failures stop registering as independent experiences and are direct extensions of parental self-worth. In that distorted framework, a child isn't a separate human being. And once that boundary collapses, the emotional stakes are dangerous. The missed tryout was no longer a normal, enduring disappointment. In the end, what truly lingers from this case is not cheerleading. Not the tryouts, not the squad, not the hierarchy that once felt so monumental inside a specific moment in suburban time. Those things which once carried an intense emotional gravity have largely dissolved into memory. They no longer hold a shred of power over the people involved or the public that once watched this spectacle unfold in real time. What remains is something quieter and harder to ignore. When you strip away the tabloid headlines, the television movies, the cheap cultural shorthand of the Texas pom-pom mom, you are left with a cautionary tale about how easily meaning can become distorted when identity is no longer contained within a single life. Ambition in itself is not a crime. Neither is care or deep involvement or fiercely wanting a better life for your child. Those are all ordinary, beautiful parts of parenting. But this case sits in the dark space where those instincts lose limits and a child's lived experience is proxy for a parent's internal absence. Decades later, there is absolutely nothing left to win or lose in what once mattered intensely in Channelview, Texas. What is left is a warning, not about sports, but about the terrible price we pay when a life begins to be lived inside of someone else's. I'm Brittany Ransom, and this has been another episode of When Killers Get Caught. And I'll leave you with this final thought. The truth doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it shows up in fragments, small decisions, quiet conversations, things that don't seem important until it's too late to ever take them back. And in this case, the trail the obsession left wasn't made of blood or footprints. It was glitter, tinsel, and pom-poms. Because sometimes the cost of a crown made of tinsel is far higher than anyone was ever prepared to pay. Thank you again for listening. If you like this episode, please drop a like, follow us. We are on Spotify, YouTube, TikTok, and virtually anywhere you can listen to a podcast. Tune in next week as we discuss the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski.